He said it in front of the entire lobby, not quietly, not in a hallway, not in a way that could be mistaken for anything other than what it was. He said it while walking, which was somehow worse, not even pausing to deliver the dismissal, just letting it fall behind him like something dropped without looking down. Tamsin had been waiting 17 minutes in the glass-walled lobby of the Voss Rehabilitation Center, holding a manila folder that had nothing important in it. She had grabbed it on the way out of the treatment wing because people who were carrying things looked like they had somewhere to be, and she needed to look like that, needed the folder to justify why she was standing at the reception desk and not doing any of the 7 things on her list for the afternoon. She had tried to reach Dorian Voss 3 times that week, once through his assistant, once through the clinic manager, once by standing near the elevator at 7:15 in the morning when she knew he had an 8 o'clock call and hoping she could catch him in the 10-second window between floors. She hadn't caught him. But now he was here, physically here, which happened maybe once a month, and he was crossing the lobby with his operations director and 2 people from finance, and she had stepped forward, said his name, just his name, Dorian. He'd glanced at her the way a person glances at a notification they don't intend to open. Then he'd said it to his operations director, or to the lobby in general, or to no one specific, which was in some ways the worst version. Is she here to file a complaint again? Tell her to put it in writing. He didn't break stride. He was already at the elevator by the time the sentence was finished. The lobby had gone quiet in the particular way. Lobbies go quiet when something has happened that no one wants to have witnessed. The woman at the front desk found something very important to do with her keyboard. A physiotherapy assistant named Bo, who had been Tamsin's colleague for 18 months and who she had covered for twice when he'd run late picking up his son, looked at the floor. Tamsin stood there. She pressed the folder flat against her chest, the same way she sometimes held Winifred when her daughter had a bad dream, like if she just held something steady enough, the shaking would stop. It was not a complaint. It had never been a complaint. She had never once filed a formal complaint in 18 months, and she was the sort of person who would rather quietly fix a problem than put it in writing, because putting things in writing meant creating a record, and a record meant someone would eventually have to deal with it, and she didn't want to make more work. What she had been trying to tell him was that she had a diagnosis, that the rheumatologist at St. Michael's had called last Thursday with words she'd had to write down because she didn't trust herself to remember them under the fluorescent lights of the clinic bathroom where she'd taken the call, that there was a specialist referral, that there was a protocol, that the specialist had said twice, because apparently she had not sounded like she was taking it seriously enough, that waiting past 6 weeks was not advisable. She had written the appointment in her phone calendar and then moved it twice, both times because something at the clinic needed her first. She wanted to tell him because she thought, and here was the thing she would later understand, was the most honest and most painful part of the whole 18 months. She thought it would matter to him. Not in any romantic way, not in any way she could justify clearly. Just in the simple way that you think you matter to a place you have put yourself into completely. She turned around and walked back to the treatment wing. She didn't cry. She hadn't been about to cry. Her eyes were dry and her jaw was set, and she went back to her 2:30 patient and got through the session on autopilot, her hands doing the work they'd done for 6 years, while the rest of her was somewhere else, somewhere small and quiet, trying to locate the part of herself that had thought any of this would go differently. By 4 o'clock, the headache that had been sitting behind her right eye since morning had become something with depth to it, something that made the light from the clinic windows feel like a personal problem. She had been having headaches for 2 months. She had also been having joint stiffness and fatigue and a low-grade fever that sometimes showed up in the mornings and was gone by 9. These were the symptoms that had sent her to the rheumatologist in the first place. These were the symptoms she had been managing with ibuprofen and extra coffee, and the particular kind of willpower that looks like fine from the outside and costs considerably more than it looks. At 4:30, she sent Winifred a voice message. "Hey, Bug, I'm a bit late tonight. Can you tell Mrs. Okafor I'll be there by 6? Winifred, who was 5 and deeply serious about being 5, responded with a voice message that was mostly the sound of her eating something crunchy in a single sentence. "Mommy, Mrs. Okafor says you always say 6 and then it's 7. She was not wrong, it was almost always 7. At 4:45, Tamsin went to the equipment storage room at the end of the treatment wing. She went there because it was the only room in the clinic with no windows and no desk and no surface that needed anything from her. She sat down on the folding chair that had been there since the clinic opened, technically meant for overflow during group sessions, and she put the manila folder on the floor beside her, and she breathed. Just breathed. The room smelled like latex and disinfectant, and the particular staleness of a space that got circulated air but no actual fresh air. It was not a pleasant room, but it was quiet, and quiet was what she had been trying to find since 7 in the morning, and she was so tired, not sleepy tired, the other kind. The kind that lives in your chest and your joints and the small muscles around your eyes and doesn't respond to sleep in any reliable way. She thought about Winifred. She thought about the way her daughter had started putting her shoes on by herself in the mornings, which she'd been doing for 3 weeks, and which she approached with the focus of a small scientist conducting an experiment. She thought about the spring break they were supposed to take. Nothing big, just a few days at her mother's place in Prince Edward Island, salt water and her mom's cooking, and Winnie running on the beach until she fell asleep at 6:30. She thought, I should call the specialist office tomorrow. Actual call, not reschedule, not move it to next week. Tomorrow. She closed her eyes. She did not open them. It was Beau who found her at 5:10 when he'd come to the storage room to return a piece of equipment and found Tamsin slumped sideways in the folding chair, one hand open on her knee. Her breathing wrong in a way he recognized immediately because his mother had had a health collapse 3 years ago, and he had never stopped being afraid of that sound. He called her name twice. He had his phone out on the 3rd count. Dorian was in his car when his operations director called. The director, Hugo Bellemare, relayed the message efficiently, the way Hugo relayed most things, stripped of anything that wasn't logistically relevant. Staff physiotherapist, Tamsin Carey, found unresponsive in storage room, ambulance en route. Dorian said, which hospital? Toronto Western, most likely. He looked at his driver, turn around. Hugo, still on the line, said, I can have the clinic manager handle the. Turn around, Dorian said again to his driver. He ended the call. He arrived at Toronto Western's emergency entrance at 6:14. He had not called ahead. He had not asked anyone to manage the situation. He stood at the emergency desk and said Tamsin Carey's name and was told she'd been brought in, was being assessed, was not yet available for visitors. He waited, not seated, standing at the edge of the waiting room, where he could see both the entrance and the desk. He was not a man who waited well. He had built an organization around the principle that waiting was what happened when you didn't have adequate information, and that the solution to waiting was always more information. He had no information. He stood at the edge of the waiting room and felt it. At 7:40, a doctor came out. She introduced herself as Dr. Achebe. She looked at Dorian with the measured expression of someone who had learned not to read the room too early. Are you family? He thought about it for half a second. Yes. Dr. Achebe did not look convinced, but she continued. Mrs. Carey is stable. She's conscious. What brought her in tonight is a convergence of things that have been developing for some time. Significant exhaustion, dehydration, and an autoimmune flare that was already undermanaged. She paused. She had a referral for a specialist. It's 9 weeks old. Dorian said nothing. The flare, combined with the level of physical depletion she was already at, caused what we call a vasovagal episode. The body essentially overrides. It's not dangerous on its own, but in her state, it becomes dangerous. She looked at him steadily. She should have been at that specialist appointment weeks ago. Can I see her? She's resting. I know. Can I see her? Dr. Achibi looked at him the way people sometimes looked at Dorian, assessing the gap between what he was saying and what he would do regardless. She said, 10 minutes, quietly. The room was small and smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. Tamsin was in the bed by the window. The window looked out onto the side of another building, which gave the room a gray, underwater quality. She looked smaller than she did at the clinic. Not fragile. Tamsin was not a fragile person. He understood that from 18 months of watching her be the last person to leave the building, but smaller in the way that happens when a person stops performing their own size. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he pulled the chair from the corner and sat down. She was asleep or sedated, and he sat there with her and tried to locate, somewhere in the machinery of his mind, what he was supposed to do with this. There was no machinery for this. There was just the chair and the room and the referral letter that was 9 weeks old. He stayed for an hour. No one asked him to leave. He was back at the Voss Center by 10. He asked the night security supervisor, a quiet, meticulous man named Laurent, who had been with the building for 4 years, for the security footage from that afternoon, the lobby, the treatment wing, the back corridor. Laurent did not ask why. He had the files to Dorian by 10:45. Dorian sat in the clinic's management office with a laptop and watched the footage alone. He started with the morning because he'd found, since the hospital, that he needed to understand the full shape of the day, not just his piece of it. He watched Tamsin arrive at 7:03. He watched her check the scheduling board, notice something, go to the front desk, quietly rearrange 2 appointments without being asked by anyone. He watched her bring a coffee from the staff room to Bo, who was running a group session, and leave it outside the door without knocking. He watched her eat something standing at the prep counter at 12:15, a granola bar, half of it, and then put the other half down when her phone rang and not go back for it. He watched himself arrive at 1:42, moving through the lobby like someone who had already decided where they were going and had no interest in anything that required stopping. He watched her see him from across the lobby. He watched her take a breath. He watched her step forward. He watched his own face from the lobby camera, the overhead angle making everything slightly impersonal, which was somehow useful because it let him look at himself the way you look at a stranger. He watched his face do the thing he had not been aware it was doing. Not cruel, exactly. Something worse. Completely absent. Like whatever she was didn't register as information worth processing. He heard his own voice. The audio was poor from that distance, but he could read what he'd said from context. Is she here to file a complaint again? Hugo nodding, specifically. The woman at the front desk dropping her eyes. Bo going still. He watched Tamsin. He watched her press the folder flat against her chest. He watched her stand there for a count of 3, 4, 5, and then nod, once, the way you nod when a meeting ends on a bad note, but you're not going to make it worse, and walk away. Her face on the footage, from the lobby camera, not hurt, not angry. Something flatter than both of those. Something that looked like a person who had already factored this outcome into the calculation and had still tried anyway. That was the part that landed in his chest. She had expected it. She had stood there expecting it and had still tried because whatever she needed to say had been worth one more attempt. He watched her walk the length of the treatment wing. He forwarded to the storage room camera. There wasn't one inside, but there was one in the corridor, and he watched the door close behind her at 4:47. He watched the corridor. He watched nobody check on her. He watched the door stay closed for 23 minutes until Bo came down the hall with a piece of equipment under his arm. He watched Bo stop. He watched Bo go in. He closed the laptop. There was a scheduling notebook on the management desk, a physical one, spiral-bound, with color-coded tabs. He didn't know whose it was. He opened it. It was Tamsin's. Not a journal, a working document. Appointments, patient notes, staff schedules, cross-referenced, with treatment plans. But in the margins, in a handwriting that was small and even and slightly tilted, there were other things, notes she had apparently written to herself and not erased. A note that said, "Bo has custody pickup Thursdays at 4. Don't book him past 3:30. A note that said the back treatment table squeaks when wait shifts left. Patient's notice. Maintenance request filed March 3rd. Filed again April 9th. Follow-up. A note about a patient, a 60-year-old man recovering from a knee replacement, that said he doesn't like to be called brave, but he is. Mark it quietly. He found his own name on the 9th page. She had noted the times he was most likely to be reachable. Tuesdays before 9, occasionally Friday afternoons. She had noted that he responded better to documentation than to summaries. She had written, "He doesn't hear it the first time if it sounds like a problem, but if it looks like a solution, he reads it." She had been studying how to reach him for months, and he had made her wait 17 minutes in a glass lobby and then walked away. He found the referral entry near the back. The date was 9 weeks ago. She had written the specialist's name, the appointment time, and then underneath, "Dorian has the Bellamere board presentation this week. After." After hadn't come. He understood that now. He turned the notebook over in his hands. Read the margin notes again. Thought about a woman who had been at his clinic for 18 months, who had memorized the personal schedules of every staff member and the maintenance backlog and the best way to get her boss to actually read a document, and who had apparently not once factored herself into any of it as a priority. He picked up his phone. He called Hugo. Hugo answered on the second ring. "The performance metrics from Q1, Dorian said, "the ones presented to the board in March. I want the source data, all of it, by morning." A pause. "The source data is all in the system." "I want it on my desk, not in the system, printed with the original timestamps." Another pause. Shorter, but there. "Of course. Is there something specific?" "Morning," Dorian said, and ended the call. He didn't know yet, not for certain, but he had been building organizations for 20 years, and he knew the difference between the pause of a man who needed a moment to organize information and the pause of a man who needed a moment to figure out how much you knew. Hugo's pause had been the second kind. By 7 the next morning, he knew. Holloway Group, the firm Dorian had retained to audit the Voss Rehabilitation Division, sent preliminary findings at 6:52. It had taken them 11 hours. The discrepancy ran across 6 quarters. The mechanism was almost elegant in its construction. Someone had taken the clinic's genuine performance data, the meticulous, granular record-keeping that Tamsin and the clinical team had maintained, and selectively amended it before it reached the board. Not fabricated, adjusted. The kind of adjustment that a person who understood both the data and the reporting pipeline could make without triggering automated flags. Hugo Bellamere understood both the data and the reporting pipeline. More than that, Hugo was the person who had recommended Tamsin for the physiotherapy position 18 months ago. She had worked at a smaller clinic in Mississauga before, a clinic in which, the auditors noted in a footnote, Hugo had held a minor consulting position the year prior. The pattern was clear enough once you were looking for it. You place someone who will make the clinical operations genuinely excellent, who will care, who will be thorough, who will produce real results that produce real numbers, and then you use those real numbers as cover while you adjust the margins at the top. The clinical performance is legitimate, the reporting is not, and if anyone ever looks closely, there's a meticulous, well-regarded physiotherapist whose records back up the baseline data completely. Tamsin hadn't known. That was immediately clear to Dorian, from the notebook, from 18 months of footage he was now looking at differently. She was not a performance. She was the reason the performance numbers were real. And someone had built a fraud around the fact that she was exactly who she appeared to be. He called his legal team at 7:15. He called the board chair at 7:40. He arranged for Hugo to be met at the building entrance by 2 people who were neither security nor colleagues. He was at Toronto Western by 9. Tamsin was sitting up in the hospital bed when he came in. She had color back, not the color she'd had at the clinic, That particular kind of color that comes from being in constant motion, but present color, living color. She was holding a cup of tea with both hands, the way you hold something when your hands need to be doing something, but there's nothing to do. She looked at him when he came through the door. Her face went through a quick sequence of things she didn't fully manage to hide. Surprise, then something careful. Then, and this was the one that did something to him, something that was almost relief, before she put the careful expression back on top of it. "You didn't have to come," she said. He pulled the chair close and sat down. "The lobby," he said. "Yesterday. What were you trying to tell me?" She looked at her tea. Tamsin. She looked up. Her eyes were clear and a little tired, and he noticed for the first time, a quality of stillness that was different from composure. Composure was a thing you constructed. This was something else. "I got a diagnosis," she said. "Autoimmune. Lupus, actually. Early stage, manageable, but I needed to see a specialist, and I'd been moving the appointment." She kept her voice level. "I wanted you to know I'd be taking a few days. I wasn't asking for anything. I thought you should know." She paused. "I didn't think I'd have to try for a week to say it." "You had the referral for 9 weeks." She looked at him. "I found your notebook," he said. "It was on the desk in the management office. I wasn't looking for it. I was looking at security footage." He watched her face. "The referral date. And next to it, you'd written my calendar, the board presentation." She looked at the window, at the side of the building, outside the window. "It wasn't just that week," she said. "There was always something. That's on me. I know how to reschedule things when they're urgent. I just kept deciding this wasn't urgent enough yet." "A lupus diagnosis is urgent enough. I know that now." She didn't say it defensively, just flatly, as fact. "At the time, I convinced myself I was being practical." He looked at her hands around the cup. He thought about the notebook, about the margins full of other people's schedules, and the things that mattered to other people, and his name with careful notes about how to reach him, as if reaching him were a problem to be solved rather than something that should have required no effort at all. "There's something else," he said. She looked at him. He told her about Hugo. He told her the way you tell someone something they deserve to hear in full. The audit, the adjusted numbers, the pattern of it. He told her that Hugo had referred her to the position, told her that part slowly, watching her face, and what that referral had been designed to accomplish. He told her that she had not done anything wrong, that her records and her work were the only real thing in the reporting chain, that the fraud had been built specifically around the fact that she was exactly who she appeared to be. He watched her face. She was not a dramatic listener. She sat very still, her hands around the cup, her eyes tracking something internal. When he finished, the room was quiet. "He used my charts," she said. "Yes." The performance data, all those months of yes. She absorbed that. "How much?" "We're still calculating. Significant." She pressed her lips together. "Did he know I was sick?" "We don't know yet." She nodded slowly, the kind of nod that isn't agreement but processing. "I don't know if that makes it better or worse," she said. "If he placed me there knowing I'd run myself into the ground covering for a clinic he was hollowing out." She stopped. "If he chose me because I'd never stop and never ask for help." "We're going to find out," he said. "The legal process will find out." She looked at her tea. It had gone cold. She was holding it anyway. "I have a daughter," she said. "Winifred. She's 5. She said it the way you say something that is load-bearing, that explains other things. I've been telling myself I was managing everything because of her, because she needs stability, because I can't afford to be the one who falls apart." She looked at him. "But I think I've just gotten very good at not stopping." He didn't say anything, because she wasn't finished. "The appointment," she said, "I'll make it today. From here, before they discharge me, I'll make the actual appointment." "I know you will." She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, a small recalibration, like a lens adjusting to a different distance. "You said that like you know me," she said. I watched 4 hours of security footage last night. He held her eyes. I know how you work. I just wasn't paying attention while it was happening. The monitor beside the bed beeped softly. I said something in that lobby, he said. I said it without stopping, without thinking. I want you to know I read every word of that scheduling notebook last night, and I understand what it cost you to stand there and try, and I understand what I did when I walked away. He paused. I'm sorry, completely. She looked at him for a long time. The color in her face was even now, and her hands around the cup had gone still. Okay, she said. Not forgiveness sealed up and delivered. Just a door left open a crack. Just, I'm hearing this. I'm deciding what to do with this. Come back and we'll see. He stayed. He was there when Dr. Achibi came in for the morning check, and he moved to the hallway and came back. He was there when Tamsin called the specialist office and made the appointment, a real one, written in her phone with 3 reminder alarms set, and she showed him the reminders with something on her face that was almost a challenge, like, I'm doing it right this time. Witness it, and he witnessed it. He was there at 11:30 when the door opened and a small girl in a purple coat came in ahead of a woman, Tamsin, called Auntie Ruth, and the girl climbed directly onto the bed without asking anyone's permission and said, Mommy, you look tired, with the frank diagnostic assessment of a 5-year-old who had apparently been studying faces for context clues for some time. I am tired, Bug, Tamsin said. She pulled her daughter close, face against the top of her head. But I'm okay. Winifred looked at Dorian with the flat, evaluative stare of a small person who had not yet learned to pretend not to be looking. Who are you? She asked. I work with your mom, Dorian said. Winifred considered this. Do you make her work too much? Dorian looked at Tamsin. Tamsin's face was doing several things at once, the most visible of which was trying not to laugh. We're working on that, Dorian said. Winifred appeared to find this acceptable. She turned back to her mother, climbed further onto the bed, and inserted herself under Tamsin's arm with the comfortable authority of someone who had done this 1,000 times, and Tamsin held her, and the room had a quality to it that Dorian had not expected, not heavy, not complicated, just present. Just a woman and her daughter in a hospital room on a cold Toronto morning, and a man in the chair by the door who had spent 18 months not seeing what was directly in front of him, and was now, finally, looking. She came back to the clinic 3 weeks later. Not to the same role. He had already restructured the position before she left the hospital, had brought in an administrative coordinator to handle the operational load, had adjusted the caseload, had made the Thursday 4 o'clock boundary non-negotiable on her calendar, so she could pick up Winifred herself, without the babysitter, without the voice messages that said she'd be there by 6 and then arrived at 7. She'd argued with him about it. Not loudly. Tamsin didn't argue loudly, but thoroughly, with the specific persistence of a woman who had spent a long time being self-sufficient and was not entirely comfortable being considered. I don't need the caseload reduced, she'd said. No, he'd said. But you need to not be the last person to leave the building every night. Those aren't the same thing. She had looked at him for a moment. Then she said, all right, in the tone of someone accepting a truth they'd already known and just needed to hear said out loud. The Tuesday, he walked into the clinic and found her in the treatment room with her 8:30 patient, the morning light coming through the east-facing window, and her standing with her hands on someone's shoulder joint in the careful way she had. Not rough, not brisk, the way a person touches something they know matters. He stood in the doorway for a long moment and let himself look at something he should have been looking at for a year and a half. She saw him. He didn't look away. She turned back to her patient. Later, at lunch, she ate now, at an actual table, an actual meal, and he had started doing the same thing, partly on purpose, and partly because he was discovering that stopping was not the same as losing ground. She said, without preamble, Hugo knew. He looked up. The auditors confirmed it this morning. She kept her voice even. He knew the position would require someone who wouldn't stop. He knew I'd covered extra hours at the Mississauga clinic, when 2 colleagues were on leave. He knew about Winnie, that I was on my own, that I needed the stability. She looked at her sandwich. He built the whole thing around the fact that I wouldn't ask for help. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would make that smaller. I keep thinking I should feel something cleaner about it, she said. Like it should be simple. Someone used me. I'm angry. Done. She looked up. But I did it to myself too, in a way. Not the fraud, but the part where I decided my needs were always the thing that could wait. She paused. I was hiding in usefulness. It's a very easy place to hide because everyone is grateful and no one asks you to come out. He looked at her. I said something in that lobby, he said again. I know. Not just the words, the whole 18 months before the words, the fact that reaching me had become something you had to strategize. He set down his coffee. That's not something I can undo, but I've been thinking about what I want to build going forward, not just here. He looked at her directly. You're someone I want to know, not because you keep the clinic running, because of everything I read in that notebook, and everything I saw in 4 hours of footage, and everything Winifred said to me in that hospital room. Tamsin looked at him for a long time. Outside the window, it was the beginning of April, and the trees along the street had started their tentative, unconvinced, early spring effort, not fully green yet, but trying. I'm going to hold you to it, she said. I'm not very good at being someone who asks for things, but I'm learning. And when you go quiet and think everything can wait, I'm going to say something. Good. Every time. Good, he said again. I need someone to. She looked at him. Something in her expression settled, not into resolution, but into the particular quality of a person deciding to be present inside something uncertain, instead of managing it from a safe distance. Okay, she said. Just that, the same word as in the hospital room, not a conclusion, a beginning that admitted it was a beginning. Outside, the trees kept trying. The April light fell through the window and sat on the table between them, ordinary and unhurried and entirely theirs. In May, she made every appointment. She sent Dorian the confirmation for the specialist follow-up without him asking, which he understood was its own kind of statement. I'm doing this, and I'm letting you see me doing it, and that is not a small thing for me. He sent one back, an appointment he'd made with his own GP, the first one in 4 years. It said simply, your turn. She replied, it's about time. Winifred, who had decided that Dorian was acceptable company primarily because he knew how to play go fish and did not cheat in obvious ways, had taken to leaving small crayon drawings on his desk on the days Tamsin brought her to the clinic after school. The drawings were mostly of horses, for reasons Winifred had not explained, and occasionally of a family of 4 stick figures with a large yellow dog, despite the fact that no one in the arrangement had a dog. He left them on the desk. He did not put them away. There was a morning in late May, the kind of morning that arrives in Toronto after a long gray winter, like a small apology from the climate, when Tamsin came in early and found him already there, at the window of the management office, looking out at the street. She had brought 2 coffees, which she did sometimes now, not every day, not as a system, just when she felt like it. She set one on the desk near him. He looked at it, then at her. I've been thinking, she said, that I owe you something. You don't owe me anything. Not like that. She held her own cup. I mean, you read the notebook. You sat in that chair for an hour and watched me sleep. You had Hugo removed in a day. She looked out the window. I've been very careful not to need people. I've made a whole practice of it. And I'm trying to be in a different practice now. She looked at him. Thank you. Actually. Not reflexively, not politely. Actually. He looked at her for a moment. You're welcome, he said. Just that. No architecture around it. She nodded, picked up her coffee, looked at the street, the trees, the May morning working its way through the city with its particular quiet insistence. And they stood there, the 2 of them, in the room where she had spent months working herself to the bone for a man who hadn't been looking, and where he had spent one night finally learning how to look, and where neither of them had a plan for what came next, but both of them had decided, separately and together. That presence was the beginning of everything else.